My son left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to grab a beer from the fridge. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just walking past to get my jacket from the front closet. But the speakerphone was on, and my daughter-in-law's voice carried clear as anything through that quiet house. He's 63, not 83, but the longer he stays, the harder it gets. We need to move on this before he figures out what we're doing. I stopped walking. My jacket stayed in the closet. The business is basically ours already, my son said, his voice lower than hers. He hasn't touched the accounts in months. He trusts me completely. That's the problem, she said. He trusts you too much. It makes me nervous. Just get the transfer papers ready. I've already talked to a notary. I heard the fridge close. I heard his footsteps coming back toward the kitchen. I walked to my room, sat down on the edge of my bed, and stared at the floor for a long time. The business was called Bennett & Son Landscaping. I know, my last name isn't Bennett. That was my father-in-law, God rest him, who started the company in Barrie, Ontario back in 1974 with a second-hand truck and a push-mower. When he passed, he left it to my wife and me. When my wife passed, 11 years ago, I kept it running because it was the last piece of her I had left. I built it into something real. 18 employees, contracts with 3 municipalities, a yard full of equipment that was paid for, every piece of it, and I had brought my son into it because I believed in him. Because I thought that was what you did. His name is Philip, his wife is Dara. They've been living with me for 2 years by then, since their condo in Innisfil sold faster than expected, and they said they needed time to find the right place. I gave them the master bedroom because it had the ensuite, and I figured it was just for a few months. I moved into the smaller room down the hall. A few months became 6. 6 became a year. A year became 2. I told myself I didn't mind. The house was too quiet without my wife anyway. Having Philip around felt like something, but after that phone call, I started paying attention to things I had been choosing not to see. The way Dara had slowly moved my things. My wife's china was no longer in the cabinet in the dining room. It was in a box in the garage, wrapped in newspaper. When I asked about it, Dara said she was keeping it safe. My reading chair from the living room had been replaced with a sectional sofa I hadn't been consulted about. My name was still on the mortgage, but the house had been quietly redecorated around me until I felt like a guest in my own rooms and the business. I had been handing Philip more and more responsibility over the past 3 years, grooming him, I thought. He had signing authority on the operational account. He knew all the contractors. He had the client relationships. I had been stepping back on purpose, thinking I was being a good father, thinking I was setting him up. I hadn't looked at the books in 4 months. The week after I heard that phone call, I called my accountant, a woman I have trusted for 15 years. She came to the office on a Tuesday morning when Philip was out on a site visit, and she sat across from me with her reading glasses on, her laptop open, and she went through everything quietly. When she finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at me. Someone has been moving money into a numbered company, she said. Small amounts, consistent, going back about 8 months. I asked her how much in total. She told me. I felt the number land somewhere in my chest. It wasn't enough to destroy the company, not yet, but it was enough to tell me what the plan was. Slow, patient. Transfer what you can quietly, then when enough has moved, bring in the paperwork to transfer the rest legally. By the time I noticed, it would be done. Who set up the numbered company? I asked. She pulled up the registration, Dara's maiden name, Philip, as a secondary director. I drove home that night and made dinner as if nothing had happened. Philip and Dara came in around 6:30. We sat at the table I had bought when this house was first mine, and we ate, and I listened to them talk about a trip they were thinking about taking. Somewhere in Portugal, a boutique hotel, they'd seen it on Instagram. Dara said she'd always wanted to do the Alentejo wine region. Philip said maybe spring. They asked me if I wanted anything from the kitchen, and I said no thank you, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I lay in the dark and thought about my wife. I thought about how she used to say that the hardest part of raising a child wasn't the hard years. It was the moment you realized the person they became wasn't who you had hoped they would be. She said she'd read that somewhere. I used to think it was too sad to be true. I called my lawyer the next morning from my truck, parked outside a Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street. I'd been using the same lawyer for 20 years, a quiet man named Aldous, who had handled my wife's estate and the incorporation of the business and the refinancing of the house. I told him what I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much of the business is in your name?" he asked. "All of it," I said. "Philip has operational authority, but I never changed the ownership structure." "Good," Aldous said. "That's very good. Don't change anything, don't move anything. Come see me Thursday." I went to see him Thursday. We talked for 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a plan. It wasn't a plan built on anger, even though I had plenty of it. It was a plan built on the same thing I used in business for 40 years. Information, timing, and patience. My father-in-law used to say that the best deals aren't made in the heat of a moment. They're made after you've slept on it 6 times. I had slept on it enough. The first thing I did was have Aldous prepare the paperwork to transfer operational signing authority back to me exclusively. I brought in my accountant to do a full forensic review of the past 18 months. I changed the passwords on every company account, the banking portal, the fleet management software, the payroll system. I did it on a Wednesday afternoon while Philip was at a client meeting in Aurelia. I told my office manager, a woman who had worked for me for 9 years and who I trusted with my life, what was happening. She cried a little. She said she had noticed things but hadn't known what to say. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. The second thing I did was talk to a lawyer who specialized in family law, because the house was complicated. My name was on the mortgage and the title. There was no question of ownership, but I wanted to know my options. She laid them out clearly. In Ontario, a homeowner has the right to ask occupants to vacate with proper notice. Philip and Dara had no tenancy agreement, no lease. They were guests. 60 days' notice, in writing, was all that was required. The third thing, and this one I had to sit with for a while before I did it, was that I called my son's grandmother, my mother-in-law. She was 81 years old and lived in a retirement community in Collingwood, and she was sharp as a tack and had loved Philip since the day he was born. I told her what was happening. She didn't say much for a long time. Then she said, "I always thought that girl had cold eyes. I never said it because I didn't want to make trouble." She asked me what I needed. I told her I might need a place to stay for a few weeks while things got sorted. She said her guest suite had been empty since Christmas, and I was welcome as long as I needed. I packed a bag over 3 evenings, quietly, piece by piece, while Philip and Dara were watching television downstairs. My wife's china came out of the garage. I wrapped it properly, this time in the good-moving blankets from the storage shelf, and I put it in my truck. My father-in-law's old ledger books, the ones from the early years of the business, handwritten in his careful printing. I took those too. A few photographs, the quilts from the cedar chest that had been my wife's mother's, the things that could not be replaced. I left the sectional sofa. On a Thursday morning in late October, I came downstairs at 7 a.m. Philip and Dara were still asleep. I put a sealed envelope on the kitchen table, weighted down with the spare set of house keys. Then I got in my truck and I drove north. I was just pulling onto Highway 26 when I heard my phone start ringing. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. I turned onto the county road that runs along the bay, and I rolled the window down a little, even though it was cold, because I wanted to smell the water. The leaves were past their peak, but there were still some orange ones hanging on. My wife loved October. She always said it was the only month that felt like it was built for people who paid attention. I let the phone ring. The envelope on the table contained several things. A formal 60-day notice to vacate the property, as per Ontario residential law, signed by me and witnessed by Aldous, a letter from my accountant detailing the financial discrepancies she had identified and confirming that the matter had been referred to a forensic auditor and that I reserve the right to pursue legal remedies. A letter from me, personally, not dictated to anyone, just written by hand on a legal pad at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning. That said what I needed to say. That I had loved my son. That I had wanted to build something with him and leave it to him and trust him with it. That I didn't know where it had gone wrong, whether it was something I did or something I failed to do, or whether it was simply the person he had chosen to become. That I was not going to fight him, because fighting would only destroy what was left. And I was 63 years old and had buried my wife and my father-in-law. And I did not have the energy for war, but I was also not going to stand still and let myself be taken apart piece by piece while pretending I didn't see what was happening. I told him the business was still mine, that the transfer of authority had been reversed, that the numbered company had been flagged and that he should speak with his own lawyer about the implications, that he and Dara had 60 days, and I told him that the door was not closed, that if there came a day when he wanted to have an honest conversation, I would have it, but it would have to be his choice, and it would have to be real. I folded that letter last, and I put it on top of the others, and I sealed the envelope. My mother-in-law had the kettle on when I arrived. She had made the guest suite up with fresh sheets, and she had put a small vase of dried wildflowers on the nightstand, the kind she used to put in every room when my wife was young and the house was full. I sat at her kitchen table and drank tea, and she patted my hand and didn't ask me to explain anything more than I wanted to. We talked about the weather and her garden and a documentary she'd been watching about the Arctic. At some point, I put my head down on my folded arms, and I think I slept for a few minutes right there at the table, and she just let me. The 60 days were not peaceful. Philip called many times. He was angry, then pleading, then angry again. Dara sent me an email that I read once and then archived without responding. Their own lawyer sent Aldous a letter questioning the validity of the notice, which Aldous dealt with efficiently. There were a few days in there that were very hard. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because doubt and grief are different things, and I was grieving. I was grieving the version of my son I had believed in. I was grieving the future I had imagined, the one where I handed him the keys someday and drove away knowing it was in good hands. That future was gone. I had to let it go. They were out by the end of December. A neighbor texted me a photo of the moving truck in the driveway, and I felt nothing in particular when I looked at it, which I think was its own kind of answer. I came back to the house in January. I put the china back in the cabinet. I moved the sectional into the basement and brought my reading chair up from the storage room where they had put it. I hung my wife's photographs back on the walls of the hallway. I made a pot of coffee and I stood in the kitchen and I looked out at the snow on the backyard and the bare tree that had been there since before I owned the house. The business went through a formal audit. The forensic accountant documented everything clearly. Aldous advised me on what could be pursued and what wasn't worth the cost. I made some decisions. I kept others in reserve. That part of the story is still unfinished, and I've accepted that some things stay that way. What I know is this. I still have 18 employees who come to work every morning. I still have the municipal contracts. I still have the yard full of equipment, paid for, every piece. I hired a new operations manager, a man in his late 30s who had been with a competing firm and who knew the industry well. He started in February. On his first day, I showed him the ledger books, the old handwritten ones, the ones my father-in-law started in 1974, and I told him the story of how the company began. He listened carefully. He asked good questions. I still go in most days, though I've been thinking about scaling back, not because I'm tired of the work, but because there are mornings lately when the light comes in through the window of my office, and I think about that Arctic documentary my mother-in-law mentioned, and I think about the fact that my wife never got to travel the way she wanted, and I wonder what it would mean to go somewhere just because I felt like it, for no other reason than that. My son and I have not spoken since the phone calls in December. I don't know if that will change. Some days I think it will. Some days I think it won't. Either way, I'm done waiting for a life to begin after this one ends. I'd been here before, standing at the edge of a loss, not knowing what comes next. What I know now that I didn't know the first time is that something does come next. You don't get to choose what it looks like, but it comes. I drove up to Collingwood last weekend to have dinner with my mother-in-law. She made a roast, and we watched the sunset over Georgian Bay from her balcony with our coats on, both of us too stubborn to go inside. And she told me about a trip she'd taken to Cape Breton with my wife's father in 1987, when they were young and broke and the car broke down twice and they ate fish and chips on a wharf in the rain. And she said it was one of the best weeks of her life. I told her that sounded about right. She poured more wine and we stayed out until the sky went dark and the first stars came up over the water, and neither of us felt the need to say very much at all. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all this, that I keep coming back to. I'm sitting at my mother-in-law's kitchen table in Collingwood with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I realize I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired in the way you get tired after carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. That's when I understood what the past year had actually cost me. Not the money, not the business, not the house. What it cost me was the story I had been telling myself about who my son was. The hardest part of what Philip did wasn't the financial part. An accountant can document that. A lawyer can address it. What can't be filed or remedied is the fact that he looked me in the eye every single day while it was happening. We ate dinner together. We talked about the weather. He asked if I needed anything from the kitchen. I have thought about that a lot. How a person can split themselves in two like that, can be warm and present in one layer while something cold and deliberate runs underneath. I don't have a full answer, but I think it starts small. A compromise here, a rationalization there, and eventually the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be gets wide enough that you stop noticing it. That's a consequence I didn't choose, but it's one that followed naturally from choices he made, one after another, over months. That's how it works. Not in dramatic moments, but in small, accumulated decisions that eventually add up to a person's character. What you do when no one is watching, or when you think no one is watching, that's the thing that actually defines you. Philip thought I wasn't watching. He was wrong about that. But even if he had been right, the choices would have defined him anyway. What got me through was something I didn't fully recognize as strength until it was over. It wasn't anger. Anger would have made me move too fast, make noise, give them time to cover their tracks. What carried me was the ability to stay quiet and think clearly when everything in me wanted to react. My accountant, my lawyer, my office manager, the forensic audit, the 60-day notice drafted correctly and served properly. Every step was deliberate. Every step was documented. That kind of steadiness, the ability to keep your head level when the ground is shifting. That's something you either build over a lifetime, or you don't have it when you need it. I'm grateful I had it. I'm not sure I would have 20 years ago. And then there's the question of what you owe people, and what you owe yourself. I left the door open for Philip. I said it in the letter and I meant it, not because what he did was acceptable, but because I'm 63 years old and I've learned that closing doors permanently is a decision that echoes longer than you expect. Whether he ever walks through that door is not something I can control. But leaving it open, that was the right thing. I knew it when I wrote it, and I still know it now. My wife used to say that the quality of a person's life is largely determined by the quality of their choices, and that the quality of their choices is largely determined by what they believe they deserve. People who believe they deserve things they haven't earned make certain kinds of choices. People who believe they have to build what they want, honestly, over time, make different ones. I build everything I have that way. The business, the house, the trust of the people who work for me. None of it came quickly, and none of it was handed to me. That's not a lesson I could give Philip. It's not the kind of thing you can give anyone. You either learn it by living it, or you spend your life taking shortcuts and wondering why nothing ever quite whole. I drove home along the bay that January morning with the heat on and the radio low and the snow on the fields catching the early light, and I thought, this is still mine. All of it, the company, the house, the years ahead, still mine. That's enough. That's more than enough.